Let's talk about training versus potentiation of our bracing. There's a lot of misunderstandings here and a lot of mistakes that even high-level coaches make when they talk about this. There's a very important delineation between these two activities or goals. One of them is meant to potentiate performance. One of them is meant to do in warm-ups or prior to heavier loaded movements, your primary movements for the day, to make performance better, while the other is meant to actually train to produce an effective training stimulus to our bracing musculature. They're done at completely different segments of your training plan or your actual training session rather, but furthermore, they're done with completely different intensities and goals in mind. And a lot of coaches make one fatal, very concerning mistake. Actually, coaches, athletes, and clinicians all alike make this mistake very consistently. They use them as synonymous terms. They use them in the exact same way, but the fact of the matter is, if you switch the order of these things, it gets very concerning very quickly. But prior to getting into this, there's going to be some information we have to preface this conversation with. So let's go ahead and start off with some of that stuff. But first, let's go ahead and talk about the importance of promoting trunk stability to set the groundwork, to set the base of understanding what we're talking about today. And I'll run through this relatively quickly. So understand that this here, our trunk, what we're trying to do is create a 360 sheath of rigidity. There's two analogies I love to use to reference this to get everybody to understand. And if you're a coach out there, you already know this stuff likely, but these analogies you can steal from me, use for your clients. So there's actually still really good information. The first of which is the guy wire analogy. So think about a tall structure out in front of Kabuki. We have a radio tower, and surrounding that radio tower rather is wires. Wires that connect to various points of the structure, and they connect to the floor around it in a 360 sheath. And what these wires do is it makes the tower itself resistant to change. It makes it be able to stand the test of time and stand through conditions, making it an immovable force so it doesn't fall on top of this wonderful building and hurt somebody, or worse yet, kill somebody. So this stuff's actually rather important for a tower, just like it's important for this to be fully stable when we're trying to lift load, because that load is actively trying to crush us, and this is our guy wire system, right? Trunk stabilizers are the wires. The spine is the tower. Another analogy I really like to use, because some people aren't too familiar with guy wires, is a soda can analogy. Soda can, we have lots of videos out there that describes this really well and gives a perfect example of what I'm talking about, where when a can of soda is fully pressurized and it's completely stable and is in the same condition it comes in, what happens is I can stand on that can. All 240 pounds of me can stand on this can and it doesn't collapse because it's fully pressurized. But what happens when I stand back and I shoot a blow dart gun at it or something like that, or I poke a hole in it? Let's make that simple. I poke a hole in it, I stand on it once again, and that hole causes it to collapse. Even the tiniest little hole makes all the difference. It has to be fully pressurized, stable, and rigid, 360 sheath, just like this here. One loss in rigidity on one part of my trunk has major consequences to my ability to handle load, doing so safely and effectively. Our ability to use every single portion of our trunk stabilizer is vital for loaded movement. But we have to understand that there's certain exercises and activities we can do prior to training to potentiate this, to make it stronger, better, and to make our brain, our body, more aware of how to use the totality of it as efficiently as possible. We have to understand the differences, though, between potentiation training and actual functional capacity training, which I'll get into here in just a second, because if we use functional capacity work to potentiate, it doesn't potentiate, it degrades. And again, I'll get into that here more in just a second. But first, let's define what functional capacity is, because there's a lot of confusion around this topic, and many coaches actually think the root cause of positional faults is due to things that aren't completely accurate, right? The functional capacity limitations is the true reasoning why many major faults actually take place. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So our body has a threshold in which it can maintain balanced muscular co-contractions, ideal movement patterns that it goes through, as well as maintaining positions. It has a threshold, and once your body exceeds, or the conditions exceeds your body's threshold to maintain these things, it tends to fall apart, it tends to lose position, and it tends to go through compensatory strategies to move or stabilize, which we do not want. We want to stabilize as optimally as possible, right? We don't want to go through compensations. Now, there's three major forms of threshold. There's a speed threshold, the force threshold, and lastly, there is a fatigue threshold. Now, let's give a quick example of each one of these. A speed threshold is when a basketball player jumps up in the air to grab the ball, jumps as high as he can, and then as he lands back on the ground, the speed, the force, the speed mainly, is so quickly when he lands that his body doesn't know. It exceeds his threshold to handle that speed. So he experiences a lot of knee cave, and it puts certain structures at risk. So that's an example rather, of the speed threshold. The force threshold is when, let's say, an Olympic lifter that doesn't push heavy axial loading movements very commonly. They just push them in off season for developmental reasons to actually work towards better Olympic lifting, get them stronger for Olympic lifting. But let's say that they're pushing a 90+% squat, or more commonly a 95% of 1 rep max plus squat. When they do so, that is, they exceed their force threshold. So you start to see movement compensation, such as maybe anterior pelvic tilt, or going back to the example of knee cave. Now, the last example is going to be a fatigue threshold. If you hold a half squat, partial squat position for as long as you possibly can, your body starts to, and we'll stick to the theme of knee cave actually, but your body starts to compensate, such as knees caving in, such as back starting to round. Your body starts to compensate after a certain period of time, because that's your body's fatigue threshold. So those are three major thresholds that when our body, or when the conditions pushes our body past our ability, our threshold, or our functional capacity, that goes past our functional capacity to maintain positions under those three thresholds, then all of a sudden we tend to compensate. Now, two major examples of this within lifting are knee cave and anterior pelvic tilt. Let's briefly cover knee cave. So the reason why when a lifter surpasses, let's say, usually around 95% of their 1 rep max, when a lifter pushes past their 95% of 1 rep max number, all of a sudden their body, or central nervous system to be more specific, loses the ability to maintain balanced co-contractions. So what happens is the adductors tend to take over. So instead of a balanced co-contraction where their adductors are helping to produce force as well as their glutes are helping to produce force, so we have that balance muscular co-contraction, instead their glutes tend to turn off, even though we do not like that verbiage very much whatsoever, but their glutes lose their ability to maintain a balanced co-contraction, their adductors take over, and their knees tend to cave. Now, a quick gripe that I have about this situation: when we post about knee cave or talk about knee cave out in the public sphere, sometimes people will say, well, what about Olympic lifters? They have knee cave all the time, and their coaches teach them to cave their knees when they're squatting heavy. You know who doesn't say that? A single Olympic lifting coach. Because it's never happened. I get the privilege of actually working with Olympic lifting coach, and there's not a single one that has ever taught their athlete to cave their knees when they go to squat. Doesn't happen, especially to an excessive degree. Now, when we get to knee cave, there's actually a lot of nuance here, because knee cave to a small extent, and when they're still centrating their weight over their foot rather well, and they still have solid rooting connection, that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about really excessive knee cave, right? But there's not a single Olympic lifting coach out there that teaches their athlete to excessively cave their knees. Instead, you weirdly only see it when they surpass 95% of their 1 rep max. Isn't that funny? It's almost like they don't teach them that, right? You won't see it in their warm-ups. You won't see it in their challenging sets of 5 or 6. You only tend to see it when they push their 1 rep max or 2 rep max or 3 rep max on that last repetition especially. With that being said, that doesn't actually happen, but knee cave is a really good example of when somebody exceeds their functional capacity to maintain balanced co-contraction, therefore knees cave in, adductors take over, because their glutes are known as a phasic muscle group, and I'll go ahead and talk about that at length in a future presentation, because there's a difference between tonic and phasic muscle groups in developmental kinesiology. Phasic muscle groups tend to be the muscles that are inhibited when somebody pushes past their functional capacity to maintain balanced co-contractions, but that's a presentation for another day, very nuanced topic that we can get into in depth here soon. Now, the second example is anterior pelvic tilt. Anterior pelvic tilt, when somebody pushes past their functional capacity to maintain full trunk rigidity, their body tends to compensate by overzealously using there's spinal erectors and hip flexors, and that's when we see anterior pelvic tilts. Now, what happens when someone goes into anterior pelvic tilt? Hamstrings lengthen, quads shorten, lumbar spine extends, many bad things that we do not want to see. We would rather have a neutral spine position, a neutral pelvic position, and ideal latent tension relationships of your primary movers. So anterior pelvic tilt is another really good example of when somebody surpasses their functional capacity to maintain a stable pelvic position. Therefore, they go into anterior pelvic tilt, and changes that we do not want to see, compensations that we don't want to see take place. Therefore, their ability to handle load and do so safely tends to be detrimentally affected. Now, all this information, while not directly relevant to this presentation here, it is relevant in a way, and it's kind of the base of understanding you need to have to understand what I'm going to be talking about next, which is the difference between potentiation, bracing work, and actually training functional capacity. So let's talk about potentiation first. And there's actually one really good example from somebody that happens to be on our advisory board by the name of Dr. Stuart McGill that has something that ties into this topic really well. But most people, many people, have heard of the term spine stiffening, right? And what potentiation work, to sum this up really well within one sentence, what potentiation work does is it maximizes our body's awareness and ability to recruit as much of our trunk stabilizers as possible and create maximal trunk stabilization under loading conditions. There's exercises, drills, and things we can do prior to getting under a barbell like we would in a squat that increases spine stiffness and increases our body's ability to stabilize our trunk fully. It potentiates trunk stability performance. But these exercises are not the same as what the exercises that we would use to actually increase trunk stabilizer strength or improve its functional capacity. These are two completely different qualities that actually have completely different exercises, or more so intensities, associated with them. But let's go ahead and cover a really common potentiation drill or exercise that is popularized or was actually introduced by Dr. Stuart McGill, which is the McGill Big Three. Most people have heard of this at one point or another. It's a very heavily used potentiation to trunk stability performance prior to heavy movements, very, very heavy used form of that. And what it is the curl up, the bird dog, and the side plank. People do those three exercises prior to getting under a barbell to potentiate performance or potentiate bracing performance specifically. Now, the reason these three exercises are used, the reason McGill loves these three exercises, is that the curl up really potentiates the performance of our anterior or front trunk stabilizers. The side plank more so potentiates and biases towards our lateral trunk stabilizers. While lastly, the bird dog potentiates and maximizes the ability to utilize the posterior trunk stabilizers. So these three exercises focus on those three pieces of our trunk stability so that we can maximally utilize them and have maximal awareness of them prior to getting under load so we stabilize better. So that is an example of potentiation work for trunk stability. And you'll notice that all three of those exercises are rather easy. None of them are loaded. They're rather easy to do. Now, to be fair though, if you do them well, and really well at that, they actually end up being pretty challenging. They get you sweating, they get you a little bit out of breath. But as far as actual fatigue of our trunk stabilizers, they don't generate much at all. In fact, practically none. Instead, it just helps you recruit them better. But as far as the intensity of how much these need to be used and how much it tires these out, it's non-existent. Why? Because we're doing it prior to training. We're trying to potentiate, not actually train the stabilizers themselves, just potentiate performance of them. So that is a major difference. Potentiation is lighter, lower intensity, and happens prior to your main compound lifts. That's a vital discrepancy to make, because if we actually look to train and work and create an adaptable stimulus to these trunk stabilizers, intensity has to go up exponentially, and ideally we do that once we're done with our heavy loaded movement that we rely on these so much to move safely and effectively through. Now, other movements I really like to use for potentiation effects are going to be dead bugs and breathing drills, right? But when it comes to dead bugs, that's a really versatile exercise we can use to actually train the trunk stabilizers or potentiate performance. The key difference is intensity or load. So when we use dead bugs to potentiate, we do them weightless with much lower repetitions and much lower intensity overall. When we do dead bugs to actually create an adaptable stimulus to trunk stabilizers, we use exponentially more load, higher repetitions, or just a higher intensity. But let's go ahead and move on to functional capacity training for the trunk stabilizers. I've already talked about much of it through my last little slide I went through there, but these take place, once again, these take place after you're done with your heavier loaded movement, and they're meant to improve your functional capacity to utilize them fully under hard conditions. So for example, for somebody that every time they surpass 90% of their 1 rep max, they end up going to anterior pelvic tilt, they compensate in that way. Heavy loaded dead bugs at the end of a training session can help improve the strength of your trunk stabilizers, therefore make you have better ability to avoid compensations under heavier loaded movements. But if you do that same thing prior to heavier loaded movements, tires them out, fatigues them, and can actually hurt your performance for said loaded movement or your main exercises or training exercises for that day. Very big difference in terms of where we put loaded high-intensity dead bugs versus weightless potentiation dead bugs. Very different places we place them in the actual workout. So some examples of training exercises to improve functional capacity of trunk stability or improve and create a adaptable stimulus for your trunk stabilizers. Examples of this, I've already mentioned the weighted dead bug. That's a really good one. That's one of our favorites here. Another good example is ab rollouts. Ab rollouts, when done well, are an extremely challenging exercise that creates fantastic adaptations for the trunk stabilizers. Another really good example is quadruped rows. Quadruped rows, fantastic. A little bit more oblique bias when it comes to development there, but all three of those are really good examples of exercises that seek to actually train or improve the functional capacity of your trunk stabilizers. And again, they're placed in a completely different place in your actual training day or training session, and they're there for a completely different reason.